Alright guys, I'm here back with a new video, and in this video we are back with another Survivor ranking. This time we'll be ranking every fire making challenge across the history of Survivor US. Now this will only include fire making challenges that happened at Tribal. I will not be including random immunity challenges or the fire making challenge that happened at IOI or any other circumstance outside of fire making challenges that happen at Tribal. Obviously we have one every season in the modern day, but also had some here and there back in the day. So we have 15 fire making challenges to run through. And with that, let's start off at the very bottom at number 15. The worst fire making challenge to me comes from Survivor David versus Goliath. We have Mike versus Kara, and this one was just so bland where like there's nothing of intrigue going on here, where I feel like every other fire making challenge there's at least like a minor thing to point out. There's really nothing to really point out for Mike and Kara outside of, I guess, Mike's reaction at the end. He does have a fun reaction to winning, but it's such a minor thing. I mean, Mike is in the lead from right in the beginning. Kara struggles the entire time. Again, not much of intrigue going on here, so for me, lands here at 15. Now number 14, we're moving on to a fire making challenge that if I was including the entirety of the Tribal, this would actually be a pretty high one. But because the actual fire making challenge itself was very lackluster, I do have to land it here towards the bottom, and that is Ian's versus Jen's from Survivor Palau, where again the Tribal itself is pretty good. I mean, this is a Tribal where Tom finds out Ian was planning on voting him out, and through that flips his vote at the last second, and that's what causes the tiebreaker to begin with, to where to go to fire. And we have both Tom and Katie just berating Ian throughout this Tribal. So again, the Tribal itself is fun, but when we get to the fire making challenge, it's very lackluster. It's one where again Ian is ahead the entire time. It's super quick. It's really such a minor part of the Tribal. So because of that, again, like there's not really much to rank here. The reason I did put it above Mike and Kara is because again, like at least the context around it is a lot more interesting. But again, it's another one where the actual fire making challenge itself is very lackluster. So because I had to land it here at 14. Now number 13, very similar thing, but this one's probably even more important to the history of the show. And we're sticking with Palau at 13, and we do have Stephanie versus Bobby John. And obviously, this is a very iconic scene, like Stephanie versus Bobby John, the last two members of Oolong, this determining which one of the two make it to the quote-unquote merge, and also leads to this legacy of Stephanie that makes her one of the most famous players in the history of the show. But again, the fire making challenge is not the most interesting. Like while the context around it is really good, the fire making challenge itself is again super quick. But to make it be a step above Ian and Jen's is the fact that the underdog wins. Like the edit tries to make you think that okay, Bobby John's easily gonna win this, but then Steph ends up winning it instead. Now we know from real life supposedly what happens, that Bobby John did win, but Steph had some faulty equipment, I believe it was, and they redid it, and then Steph won on the redo. But I don't even think the show makes as big of a deal of Steph winning here as they could have, and really just kind of comes off as anticlimactic. But again, the entire context around this situation, plus also the fact that like the winner is a bit of a surprise in comparison to Ian and Jen, leaves it above it here at number 13. Now number 12, we're moving back to a modern fire making challenge. We're moving all the way to Ghost Island, where we have Wendell versus Angela. And this is another one that is just kind of boring because it's obvious that Wendell is going to win. However, there are some interesting moments within this one that do elevate it above the ones we've talked about already. And we have this talk about the orange curse, and Wendell doesn't want to sit at the orange podium, so then he switches with Angela, only to end up beating her. That's a funny element of this Tribal. You also have the fact that once Wendell's fire starts, he starts like staring at Dom as if he's saying like, I'm coming for you. I think that's also really fun. But I mean, this is really a blowout. Like Angela couldn't even start a fire before Wendell won here. So again, like it's mostly in line with the ones we've already talked about. However, I do think there's more gravitas put into this fire making challenge with little fun moments here and there, but it's still a mostly lackluster one, and because that lands here at number 12. Now number 11, we're moving on to the most recent fire making challenge, and here we have from Survivor 42, we have Mike versus Jonathan. And I mean, this one is another like mostly uneventful one. I would actually say Wendell and Angela probably have more interesting individual moments within it, but Mike and Jonathan's was probably a closer race. I mean, both of them did have a fire. You at least kind of thought maybe there was a chance Jonathan could catch up. And we do have like Mike building this like massive inferno that's like minorly notable. But I mean, like as a whole, again, it's a pretty baseline fire making challenge. I actually think this is probably one of the more forgettable ones on the board. But again, I do think the race between Mike and Jonathan was a bit closer to elevate it slightly to be here at number 11. Now, number 10, moving on to fire making challenge that I never really clicked with. I felt like this was one that I expected to be towards the bottom, but it turns out there's a lot of other mediocre ones. But at number 10, from Survivor Co. Wrong, we have AUBRY versus CYDNEY. And this is one that just felt very fine to me. Like, it just feels like a very basic fire making challenge. Not much of note really until the very end of it. Where again, the biggest moment of this fire making challenge to me is AUBRY's fun reaction to her winning. And we do get a notable exit for CYDNEY where she's very emotional, talking about how she wanted to do it for her mom. And that's a great scene. But again, like when we're talking about the fire making challenge itself, not much of interest really happens there. I mean, like AUBRY gets a strong fire right away. CYDNEY can't really start a fire. AUBRY wins. It's fine. Again, I feel like it's more notable for things that happen after the challenge, but it was still good enough here to land here at number 10. Now, number 9, we're moving on to one that is elevated a bit from the fact that this is one that legitimately just decides the winner. I mean, one of these two people were going to win the game. So, like, there were a lot of stakes put into this fire making challenge. And at number 9, we do have from Survivor Gabon, Bob versus MATTY. Again, this is another like mostly standard fire making challenge. It's actually like kind of a blowout in the sense that MATTY really struggles to make one. Bob makes a massive one and like loses at a point, but then is able to bring it back and win. But again, this is one I think the stakes are much higher. I mean, I guess for the AUBRY and CYDNEY, it was kind of there too because like you were under the assumption that one of them would win when it turns out Michelle would win. But here it's like this one legitimately decides the winner. So again, I think that adds like to the stakes of this tribal. Also, I feel like the context around this tribal is a bit more interesting, like where the AUBRY and CYDNEY one, it's just like Ty flipping in a position where Ty was already close with AUBRY when he wasn't that close with CYDNEY. Here, this is a situation where Sugar is super close to both Bob and MATTY, and then we have this storyline of her flipping to Bob because he reminds her of her dad who just passed away. And yeah, like I feel like the context around this tribal is a lot more interesting to me. So it's because of that, and also it designed a winner. I land above it at number 9 here. Now, number 8, moving on to another fire making challenge that is kind of in a similar ballpark. I mean, this one doesn't decide the winner necessarily, but I do think it has a number of decent moments within it, and I think the context of it is a lot of fun too. At number 8, we do have from Survivor IOI, we have Dean versus Lauren. And again, the context around this fire making challenge is really fun, where we obviously see that Tommy manipulates Nora into putting Dean in instead of him, but also we have this like Nora versus Lauren feud once Nora tells Lauren that she's going in, and we have some bickering between them at Tribal, and that's kind of interesting. But when it comes to the fire making challenge itself, again, it is a solid one. Again, kind of in line with the last few we talked about, where like the fire making challenge itself isn't the most interesting element of these sequences. But then we do get a great reaction to Dean winning here, where when Dean says immediately after winning, the first time he made fire was this morning, and he doesn't know what Nora is talking about, and it ends it with Tommy played her, and then we get this reaction from Jack saying Tommy played you, and I always love that little moment there. But again, at the end of the day, kind of just a middling fire making challenge, but one that has like little moments and also like an interesting context that does bring it up a little bit here at number 8. Now number 7, moving on to another one of these challenges that like when I rewatched it, I was like, this isn't that interesting. But then in context of all the fire making challenges, I guess it was better than a lot of them. And at number 7, we do have from Survivor Panama, Danielle versus CIRIE. And the context behind this is just kind of weird because like obviously it's like Terry has an idol, but Aris has immunity. So like kind of by default, Danielle and CIRIE are going into fire. And like we also get like a weird cliffhanger before the fire making challenge because the votes themselves are read in the penultimate episode, but then the finale starts with the actual fire making challenge, which is kind of a weird way that they did it here, mainly because the schedule is messed up due to the Bruce medevac. But this one is a lot more back and forth. Like the fire making challenge itself here is a lot more compelling than the ones we just talked about, especially because CIRIE is supposed to be this like big fan favorite figure, and the CIRIE end up losing here against Danielle after again a really close race where it goes back and forth. It is a bit more riveting of TV. We also have a fun reaction from Terry to Danielle winning, which I always found fun. And like as a whole, I think this is a solid fire making challenge, but definitely not one that I looked at too highly when I rewatched it. But it's like, again, in comparison to a lot of the other ones, like this is certainly better than the ones we've already talked about. And because that it's here at number 7. Now number 6, and now we're getting to actually good fire making challenges. I think from this point on, these are all very strong segments for the show. At number 6 here, though, we are starting it off with a very controversial one. It is the first forced fire making challenge, and that is from Survivor HHH. We have Ben versus Devin. Obviously, a lot of talk around this fire making challenge is that how rigged it was for Ben, and again, obviously, it greatly benefited him in a position where he didn't know that this was even coming, and we do see a great reaction from him when he finds out he's going to get a second chance here. But really, the context of this challenge is really great in the sense that obviously we have Ben, this person who had been fighting for the last few rounds to survive, and now loses final immunity due to having an upside down U, him getting a second chance to get into the final, while also Devin, this like big boss for him, the person that's been making the fire for the camp, and the one that's known as the best fire maker, goes against Ben here and ends up losing in a fashion where he can't even get a fire started. I think that's all like really fascinating to me. I think this is a riveting piece of television. While obviously it doesn't play out in the way that I personally would have wanted it to, as I was definitely wanting a Devin win when watching the season live, and was disappointed to see the game that Ben played being rewarded. It's like I still think it's a great story. I think to have someone with the storyline that Ben has across this season end up winning, I think is still an interesting aspect to this fire making challenge. It really props up to me, especially because we get this like big downfall edit for Devin, where again, like he is the best fire maker and he can't start a fire, and then we get the sad farewell for him. I think overall this was a really well made scene, but again, the iffiness of the rules leave it behind here at number 6. Now, number 5, we're moving on to 2 fire making challenges in a row here that are towards the top here, not because they're good, but because they're really bad. But through them being really bad, it makes them a lot more interesting of TV. And here at number 5, we're moving on to Survivor. Worlds Apart, we have Carolyn versus Rodney. Again, this one is a lot of fun. This is one where something I think is kind of forgotten about over time is how long it takes Carolyn and Rodney to make their fire here. It takes them 45 minutes to get fire, which is kind of ridiculous. But also throughout it, we have a lot of fun moments as well. I mean, we have like Carolyn breaking her flint after only 6 minutes, and Jeff allows her to switch out. At the 20-minute mark, Rodney also goes and gets a new flint, with again, none of them having a fire by that point. Later, we see Rodney switching back to his ode flint. We have Carolyn breaking her second flint. We get some great reactions from the jury with them yawning and being bored. When Rodney finally gets his fire started 45 minutes in, we get this like really funny scene of Dan Foley yelling out, "Get wood," which I always found funny. And then at the end, like, it becomes super close between Carolyn and Rodney, where Carolyn just edges out Rodney. And then we get a really emotional farewell for Rodney that's really fun, where he calls Mike a stupid piece of shit and then throws his shirt into the fire. And again, I found all of this really fun. I think this is a great fire making challenge, but a lot of it comes from how bad the 2 participants were, and also the fun reactions from certain players. So again, overall, really strong final tribal, but for me, it still lands here number 5. Now number 4, we're moving on to the definitive so bad that it's good fire making challenge. We got Becky versus Sundra from Cook Islands. And again, this is just a hilarious sequence of events. It's so fun to watch. See them both be completely incompetent in fire making. And I think an element that makes this one better to me than Carolyn and Rodney's is Jeff's clear annoyance the entire time, where Jeff is just so annoyed at both of them for not being able to start a fire. And then both like seemingly not knowing what to do. Like at least Carolyn and Rodney like kind of knew what to do and were like failing at it. Becky and Sundra legitimately just don't seem to know what they're doing. Like when they're like whacking on their flint, looking up at the camera, just like confused at what they're supposed to be doing there. Then we get time skips. We get 30 minutes pass, then an hour pass, then like everyone is yawning. Jeff is so annoyed. He tells them to stop and that we're moving on to matches, which is a really funny moment. And even then, Becky struggles to start fire with matches, but eventually both of them get fires just for them to both smother them and then go out. Then we get another time skip, 30 minutes past. Jeff is still clearly annoyed at them, and we see that they've like completely dismantled both of their fires and they're pretty much like starting from scratch again, which is again, what a disaster here. And to top it all off, before the challenge finally ends with Becky getting the fire, we get probably the funniest moment of the entire sequence, where Sundra announces she's out of matches, where somehow she's used up an entire box of matches. But again, Becky eventually wins. Again, it's a hilarious sequence of events. It's so funny, especially considering how bored the jury is, how annoyed Jeff is, how much we see like people just like hoping the challenge is going to end. And then obviously the incompetence from Becky and Sundra. It's such a fun challenge to me. I had to land it here in number 4. Now number 3, and I mean these top 3 are all pretty solid fire making challenges in the sense that they were all pretty close. They were all riveting challenges in their own right, but then all also have significance to the overall season. At number 3 here though is one that's a bit below the top 2 for me, and that one comes from season 41. We have Deshawn versus Heather, which I know is one that, like, at the time that happened, people were talking about this being the best fire making challenge of all time. I never really agreed with that, mainly because I do think the context of this one is not nearly as interesting to me, where it is a great culmination for Deshawn's arc, especially considering how much Deshawn had mentioned that he's bad at making fire, and for us to see like Heather in the lead for most of this challenge with like a really massive fire, and Deshawn coming from behind and barely edging out Heather, where her rope breaks immediately after his. Like, that's a really great sequence of events there. We also have a great reaction from Deshawn winning. Again, like, there are definitely things to prop up here. I think when it comes to the fire making challenge element of it, this is definitely one of the best. But I think something that does knock it down a bit is the overall context, in that it's not as interesting to me as the next 2, which are for me the definitive top 2. But in terms of how competitive the fire making challenge was, definitely a strong one, very close one, and because that is here at number 3. Now number 2, and for me these top 2 are extremely close, with them being just perfect fire making challenges, both in the sense that they are good challenges where the competition here is pretty close, but also in the sense that they have great context and are fantastic moments for the history of their show. So again, the debate between these 2 were very tough, where to me the determining factor really ends up being how great of individual moments I feel like they are to the show. I kind of stripped away this element of the fire making challenge to determine the 2, as again, I feel like they're extremely close when we're comparing those aspects of it. So because of that, for me at number 2, I do have Chris versus Rick. And again, this perfectly culminates the season. To have these 2 players that come from the edge of extinction, the twist of the season, face off in the final fire making challenge to determine the winner, in a position where Chris had just given up immunity to take on Rick Devens in fire, and to see this challenge be the downfall of Rick Devens is all really great context. And from a competitive standpoint, this is probably the best competitive fire making challenge ever, where these are the 2 best fire makers of the season competing against each other. That's also something to consider here. And along the way, we do get some great jury reactions, from like Reem rooting for Chris to War Dog giving Julie and Gavin the rundown of what's happening, considering they can't see what's happening, considering it's being done in a tribal council booth. And it also just perfectly wraps up the storylines of both Chris and Devens across the season, giving us this big downfall for Devens here, while also propelling Chris to his win. I do think as a whole, this is a really strong fire making challenge. The reason it's not number 1 though for me is because I do think the number 1 is a much more important moment in the history of Survivor. So for me, this one lands here at number 2. Now number 1, we're moving on to what is not only the best fire making challenge in the history of the show, it's also just in general one of the best moments in the history of the show, and a moment that pays off 20 years of investment in the show, and that is the fire making challenge between Tony and Sarah from Winners at War. And again, for me, the greatness is the context of this being Tony versus Sarah, the 2 members of Cop R Us, this really complex relationship that these 2 players have had over the course of 3 seasons at this point. And with Tony winning this fire making challenge, it pretty much declares Tony as the winner of the season, and through that, debatably the best player of all time, in that he's now a 2-time winner that have played 2 extremely dominant games. And also, like, the farewell scene between Tony and Sarah is really emotional and really just great TV, a great culmination to their story arc. And that's not even mentioning the fact that this fire making challenge is extremely close. Like, Tony and Sarah go back and forth throughout this fire making challenge, where there's one point where Sarah is burning the rope, yet her fire ends up dying out and Tony ends up coming from behind. And we also get some great reactions from the jury, with them recognizing how close this is and how great of a moment this is, them cheering when Tony finally wins. Again, it's such a fantastic moment, and for me, I just really felt like this had to be number 1. with this feeling like a culmination of 40 seasons of Survivor to cement Tony as the winner of Winners at War, the proclaimed best winner, and in a culmination of this Cops R Us storyline, but with the amount payoff that this one singular scene gives you, plus also the fact that it is a good fire-making challenge in its own right, for me it does land here at number 1. But there we go. I mean, that is my ranking of every fire-making challenge in Survivor US. Moving forward, obviously, I still want to do rankings similar to this down the road. I know I want to do jury speeches, I want to do like final immunity challenges, maybe loved ones visits, which would be an interesting one, but I know I have other ideas for this down the road, so stay tuned for those. But for now, that is the video. Thank you for watching.